Yo, what's up YouTube? This is Brendan and welcome to my channel Happier, the place where I do a deep dive on the topic of happiness by looking at it through the lenses of philosophy, science, and personal experience. And a big part of the personal experience component is that of my own, which I share with you as I really strive to be significantly happier in my own day-to-day life. And I'm excited to share with you today the first real experiment that I've done to that end, which is doing a 30-day dopamine fast or a 30-day dopamine detox. And for those of you that know what that is, you're probably thinking to yourself, why would this guy do something that's essentially a motivation hack for the sake of increasing his happiness? And I definitely have my reasons, and I'll get into those, but spoiler alert, it actually did work. It really increased my level and experience of happiness to a degree that was definitely perceptible. It wasn't tremendous or anything like that, but I did really notice it and enjoy the elevation in my happiness. And I'll get into that, specifically why I think that happened. And I also want to share a few caveats about using this practice for increasing your happiness as well. But first, if you have not heard of dopamine fasting, dopamine detoxing, really, it's just a practice that's exploded in popularity in the last few years, where you pick a set amount of time to abstain from activities that stimulate the release of dopamine in your brain's reward pathway. So really, that's just about every activity you could think of under the sun, to some degree. So this practice really just focuses on activities that are really low effort and high pleasure. So kind of the more hedonistic pursuits of life, really, where, you know, it could include anything from eating really sweet or really fatty foods, thrill-seeking, shop therapy, entertainment, sex, socially acceptable drugs like caffeine, weed, alcohol, and of course socially unacceptable drugs. These are all things that have been shown to really stimulate the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. And the goal of abstaining from these things really is to try to achieve some kind of physical reset in one's brain where you no longer have the craving for, or at least to a marked degree, have the craving for these low effort, high pleasure activities so much, and in turn you really have increased motivation to pursue things that are higher effort but of higher meaning and higher value to you in your life, really. Whether it's working on creative projects, spending time with friends, family, developing some kind of skill set, things that just take a little bit more effort. Supposedly you're going to find yourself more motivated to pursue these things. And I think it's important to note that dopamine fasting isn't really anything new. We have a new label that we've attached to it, but people for millennia have really been avoiding, worldly pleasures for the sake of personal development. But I think it's also interesting that modern science has maybe really clarified for us and helped paint a very compelling picture as to why it might be especially important in 2020 for us to try something like a dopamine fast. And to really understand why it might be important to do that, you have to know a little bit more about the neurotransmitter dopamine. So dopamine is really the molecule that is responsible for motivation. It's a misnomer that it's the pleasure molecule, and we get that idea from scientific literature that's not even really that old, where they would do studies where they would get participants and inject them with cocaine, and they were monitoring their brains and saw the more cocaine they consumed, the more their reward pathway in their brain would light up, more dopamine is being dispersed throughout the reward pathway, and of course the more cocaine the subject was taking in, the more euphoric they were reporting that they were feeling. So scientists looked at that and were like, okay, so increase of dopamine and increase of euphoria together means that dopamine is responsible for euphoria, which is totally understandable. But in subsequent years, thankfully, scientists decided to do studies on dopamine in kind of more mundane, everyday settings, with mammals where maybe, they're monitoring how they interact with food and how dopamine plays a role in that. So they would have studies with mice where they would drop food into their cages, and they'd see that the dopamine would really spike as soon as, the mouse saw the food, which is interesting. Like, how are they getting pleasure from the food before they're even eating it, right? And the plot starts to thicken when they removed the dopamine receptors completely from the brains of these poor mice. And they saw that when they dropped the food in the cage, there was no motivation for any of the mice to go and eat the food. They actually had to end up force feeding this food to the mice. But they were monitoring and saw that the mice were really enjoying eating the food. They were liking the food, but they just had no motivation to actually eat it. So from studies like that and other studies after that, scientists have really found that dopamine's role within mammals, for sure, is creating a feeling of wanting within us rather than a feeling of liking or a feeling of pleasure. And it's that feeling of wanting that gives us motivation, because when you want something enough, you're going to see your body animate, you're going to get out of your chair and go towards that thing that you want. Another interesting thing about dopamine and wanting is that a lot of it has to do with how much perceived effort there is between you and the thing you want. So the less the effort you perceive toward between you and the thing that you are desiring, between you and the reward, the more dopamine that's going to be released and the more you're going to want that thing. So for example, you could say that, everybody wants pizza. Most people want pizza, and probably everybody wants, or at least wouldn't protest being given $1 million, right? So these are two things that most people want. But if you have the pizza in your house already and it's just sitting on the counter and you're kind of hungry, at that moment you're going to want the pizza so much more than the $1 million, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, because with the $1 million you can buy tons of pizza and you can solve all these other problems that you're having in your life, maybe. And yeah, so why wouldn't you want the $1 million more? And it's really just because that there's a lot of effort that stands between you and that payout at the end of the day, right? And the more effort that's between you and the thing you want, the less dopamine is going to be released in the reward pathway, and your craving for that thing is going to be diminished. But the pizza's right there and you want the pizza now. Another interesting thing about dopamine is that it's particularly reactive to novelty, so new things, new experiences, and this kind of keeps the brain in a constant state of wanting, obviously, new things. You have a desire, you have a craving, and as soon as you fulfill that desire or craving, immediately in that moment your brain's already kind of like looking for the next hit of dopamine, for the next thing that it wants. But really, having these two elements in tandem, dopamine creating the feeling of wanting and it being reactive to novelty, from an evolutionary perspective, has just been so useful for us as a species. It's really been something that's responsible for motivating us to acquire new resources that we could leverage for our own personal survival or the survival of our genes or survival of our species. So wanting anything from, being able to find a new source of water, new foods, new mates, new tools, new information that would be useful for us in our survival, are things like acquiring power, shelter, really anything that we could use to our advantage in the game of trying to stay alive and propagate our species. Dopamine had a huge role in motivating us to do that, essentially. And now where this starts to get interesting, I think, is in the year 2020, where most of us aren't really super concerned with survival in the same way we were maybe thousands of years ago. And we have tons of very low effort, very high dopamine releasing activities at our fingertips at all times. Like, we're really just even drowning in a sea of this stuff. Entertainment at all angles, really coming to us from our handheld devices, TVs, etc. Tons of food that really, foods that exploit the dopamine reward pathway in the brain, and tons of other hedonistic pursuits that are just really right there, and we can get them pretty much whenever we want them. And this is where proponents of dopamine fasting would argue that perhaps it's more important today than ever that we actually investigate dopamine fasting and really try and give it a shot to create this reset in our brains. Because practitioners of this whole protocol, they see a very unfortunate thing happening to people's brains the more we kind of saturate ourselves in these low effort, high pleasure pursuits. And this is kind of where the rationale for dopamine fasting is a bit of a blend these days between really evidence-based research and nice sounding theory that might actually, it could be true and it could be verified, even in coming studies in the years, but we just don't have those studies yet. But what science does know is this: there are certain really not amazing brain changes that happen in the brains of addicts. So people that are not just addicted to drugs, but people that are addicted to gambling, porn, even just the internet in general, we start to see a couple things happen that are not so good. And this is because their brains are being overstimulated, specifically the reward pathway is being overstimulated with way too much dopamine. So the first thing that happens when the brain is overstimulated with dopamine, because the brain is very clever, it doesn't want to be overstimulated all the time. It wants this sense of homeostasis. So it starts to downregulate the amount of dopamine receptors, which means so it's decreasing the amount of dopamine receptors. There's less places for this neurotransmitter to bind to and send its stimulating messages to across the brain. So now your brain is less sensitive to dopamine, and this is something that you do not really want to happen, because as you decrease your brain sensitivity to dopamine, you're going to see an increase in the amount of cravings that you have, especially for these extremely high dopamine releasing low effort activities. So if you had any desire in the past to really crack open that new book that you bought, or develop some kind of skill set, something that's really useful to you that takes a little bit of discipline, that is going to disappear from your radar pretty quickly. The other thing that happens in the brains of addicts is that as they're using their brain's reward pathway more and more, the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain, it actually starts to atrophy. You're not using it as much, and your brain has this kind of use it or lose it place from which it operates. And the prefrontal cortex is responsible for so much of importance in your day-to-day life, but perhaps most notably your sense and ability to have control over yourself, your sense of self-control. So as your cravings increase and your self-control decreases, you could see why this might steer someone into a place that they don't want to be in their lives, right? Especially in the case of addicts. So that's something we definitely do know from science. Those are the brain changes that happen in the brains of addicts. And remember, they're not just addicted to drugs. The great question this raises in a lot of people's minds, including my own, is how do you really draw this line between these addicts that are in these studies and the average person living a life in 2020? Because we have all these really socially acceptable activities that are arguably vices, and they really exploit the brain's reward pathway and dopamine system, especially the internet, which is a novelty machine. There's just an endless amount of new information at every turn. You can always open a new tab or do the auto scroll, and you just get new information, even if you're not even getting pleasure out of the information. Just the hope or the sense that there might be something interesting just a click away kind of keeps you engaged and keeps the dopamine constantly releasing in your reward pathway. Same thing with social media. And we have tons of other things that are just, again, at our disposal at any moment. To what degree are any of us really addicted to these things? And I think, you could do a simple experiment of maybe, turning your phone off for a few days and seeing how that goes for yourself. If you can do it, really try it and see, do you feel addicted to this thing? Are you missing it immediately? Are you feeling a sense of anxiety that you can't, constantly be connected with it? The other question that comes along with that is, to what degree do you need to be addicted for these undesirable brain changes to start taking place in your brain? The downregulation of dopamine receptors, the loss of activity in the prefrontal cortex. Is it one of those things where it's kind of, you get to a point of addiction where all of a sudden these things start happening, or does it start happening on a sliding scale? So even if you're engaging in these activities a little bit, you're starting to downregulate receptors and have a little bit of a loss in your self-control, really. And so this is where dopamine fasting science meets just speculation at the moment. We don't have any hard evidence on the brain changes that we might be experiencing from just living a normal life in 2020. But hopefully there's enough interest in this topic as this practice starts really trending and going mainstream in a big way. Maybe we'll have some studies done on it in the near future to see really what's going on in our brains. But I do think that you can at least do a self-evaluation and just look at your own life and see if you notice any of these symptoms of addiction where, the more you let yourself slide and cave into certain hedonistic desires you might have, do you notice that in turn your craving for these desires go up? That your ability to be present and be happy in the moment and have kind of a solid sense of self-control goes down. So that's kind of a little self-assessment that we can all do, but for now that's the best we can do because we don't really have any of the science to back up what's going on in our brains as we interface with more technology and entertainment and crappy food, etc. Also, we don't really have any studies on dopamine fasting yet either, so we don't have any hard evidence that this prescription really upregulates dopamine receptors and restores functionality of the prefrontal cortex. But hopefully that's something we have in the near future because people seem to be so interested in this practice. So again, dopamine fasting and dopamine detoxing, those are both really seen as, they're really the same thing with a different name. So it's really seen as being a motivation hack where you're hopefully restoring some kind of baseline sensitivity your brain has to dopamine. So when you want to pursue something that takes a little bit of discipline, you are still tripping that reward pathway mechanism and you have that feeling of wanting created within you to give you the motivation to actually see the project through. It is really interesting, though, that there's no uniformly agreed upon way to execute a dopamine fast. There's some people that'll say you want to do it once a week, but you go really hardcore that one day a week to the point where you're not even doing things like exercising or communicating with other people because those, to some degree, stimulate the release of dopamine, right? There are others saying that you want to go for like a longer haul kind of thing. You want to do it for a whole week or do it for a whole month. And there's all these different schedules that people have come up with. And there's also a difference in opinions of the things that you should abstain from. Of course, on the super extreme side, you have the people doing the 1 day a week thing where they're not even making eye contact with other people to avoid the release of dopamine. And then on the other side, you have people saying like, hey, if you have a problem with any of these kind of traditional either thrill-seeking or hedonistic pursuit, categories of activities, you should just work on that. So if you have a problem with, shop therapy or spending too much time on the internet or watching Netflix or eating junk food, you should just focus on that. Personally, the way I decided to go about it is I wanted to see if I could really achieve, a noticeable brain reset or reset in my own perception of, how much I crave certain things or how motivated I am, and especially how happy I am. I decided to go as hard as I could for 30 days where I could still live a productive and functional life. So of course I still need to make eye contact with people. I still need to be able to interact with people and use the internet for creative projects and for my professional life. But just about everything else I completely stripped away from my life for about 30 days. So this included things like caffeine, alcohol, weed, really next to no entertainment, so I'm not like watching movies, shows, going down, like a Wikipedia article, link, click hole, really just using the internet as a tool for productivity rather than entertainment. I wasn't even listening to music. That does really trip the reward pathway system in the brain. Was eating healthy food, so I'm not eating, food saturated with fat or high in sugar. I did have the occasional falafel though, which was totally worth it. I didn't engage in anything sexually stimulating, so no sex, porn, masturbation. Didn't do any shop therapy. I was really just shopping for things that I needed, like food. Probably a couple other things that I just don't remember off the top of my head, but you get the point. I kind of removed a lot of things from my, normal life for 30 days. And before I get into the experience of what that was like, I really want to pinpoint why I decided to do this to increase my happiness, because I'm already fairly motivated and I don't really have a problem with self-control. But the more I studied dopamine and the practice of dopamine fasting and what it supposedly does, I felt like this was a good starting place, not for having a strategy to directly increase my happiness, but for having a way to overcome a barrier to happiness. And let me explain. I think the barrier that I'm talking about here is being in a state of constant wanting or constant craving, especially for things that are hedonistic and don't really add much value to your life or happiness to your life at the end of the day, really. When I think about what it's like to actually be happy, to be like really be happy, in that experience personally, I feel really free and radiant and expanded and present and just kind of like I'm shining myself into the world and I don't feel held down or limited by anything. But when I'm in the state of wanting, it feels so at odds with the state and the experience of happiness, where if I'm craving something, I'm immediately yanked out of the present moment and thinking about some non-existent future where I've really placed a contingency on my happiness until I fulfill that desire or fulfill that craving. I no longer feel free and expansive, but I feel kind of like reduced and held down and kind of chained to this desire. So I thought it might be useful to do a dopamine fast just for the sake of creating this brain reset, so I'm not bombarded by these constant cravings for things that I know aren't healthy for me and really aren't adding to my fulfillment and happiness at the end of the day. There are a couple other reasons why I thought this would be a useful practice to increase my happiness. One was I just knew I would be living a healthier lifestyle, so I'd be consuming less crap, in terms of like eating healthier food, but also consuming less content that's unhealthy. So I felt that would in turn create like an increase in my vitality and clarity of mind, which would make it easier to be happy. And the other reason is I felt that kind of flexing my willpower and doing something that's really deep down an act of self-care or self-love, doing something that I know, even though it might not be easy, it's for my own health, for my own benefit. I felt that would resonate with me in a deep emotional level, showing myself that I have that self-control and that amount of respect and care for myself, that would directly increase my happiness. And I'll get into that a little bit later in this video. So how did the whole thing go? It was difficult at times, but definitely not as hard as I thought it might have been. Day one was tough, for sure, because I have relied on some form of stimulant to to make it through the day almost every single day for the last decade, maybe even actually longer when I really think about it. But I've always needed coffee or an energy drink or some stimulating tea or, some vitamin that had like 1,000,000x% of B12 that my body actually needs. Needed something to kind of keep me going throughout the day. So that was out the window, and day one was a bit tough. I was pretty groggy and I still had a lot to do, so I was not enjoying that exactly. But thankfully, after a few days, I kind of stopped noticing that I wanted coffee or I wanted some kind of stimulation. And that whole process was just so much more quick than I thought it might have been. I was worried that I was just going to feel tired every day for the whole 30-day period. Also, within the first few days, it was interesting and a little disturbing to note how I would find myself just instinctually reaching for my phone or opening a new tab on my computer to check Facebook or check Instagram, even though I knew that I wasn't supposed to be on those sites and I didn't follow through, I didn't go on them. But just to see how deep that programming runs, that kind of every time you have a dull moment or you want to take a little break from whatever you're doing, that you just automatically want to hop on the internet and be plugged into social media or some form of entertainment, that really we just have trained ourselves to not be okay with having a dull moment, with spending extra time with ourselves and just being a person for a second. So that was a little bit alarming to me, but I also saw that within a couple days that started to go away, thankfully. And now, because this is really considered a motivation hack, for sure out the gate, my productivity went up about 20%. And that didn't really, I don't think it had anything to do with dopamine, especially in the first few days, because it's just way too early for any kind of brain reset to take place. I think it was just because I had more time to fill, and I chose to fill it by being productive. So that was great, because I have a lot going on in my life these days, and I was happy to make those gains in my professional and creative projects. Maybe around week 2, I did notice some of the things that I was hoping I was going to notice, including the increased clarity in my mind and just feeling more energetic, feeling more vital, because I really was eating quite healthy during that time. So that was awesome. And I did notice, one of the interesting things about this whole experience is, especially if you're doing it to increase your happiness, you have moments where feeling like you can't engage in something that you want to, that you're restricted and you have to block yourself off from it, makes you not comfortable. It makes you not happy sometimes, right? But also, having a goal that you're working towards is something that does increase your happiness. And this is something that science is very clear about, that we have an increase in happiness and fulfillment from having goals that we're always working towards. And then also when we achieve the goal too, it's a transient feeling, but we do have an increase in happiness. So that was something that kind of helped to drive me through this whole experience, especially when I really just wanted to call it quits and have a cup of coffee, or listen to an album or something like that. Day 25 was especially difficult. So I've already been at this for over 3 weeks, I think, and it was on a weekend, and I was just like, wow, I've been productive 7 days a week for multiple weeks now, and I can't even watch a movie on the weekend. What's up with that? It did really start to feel like a restrictive thing that, especially on that day, it was tanking my happiness, which I didn't want. But I did suspect something like that might happen. But I pushed through, I made it to day 30, and I'm really glad that I did, because I noticed a whole lot of benefits from sticking through the whole process and flexing my willpower in that way. And those benefits, they include some of the previous things that I mentioned. I do feel like I have an increase in my motivation and my ability to be productive at this moment. I think more of it does have to do with some kind of change in my brain in terms of, maybe being more sensitive to dopamine at the moment, but also maybe in those 30 days I've kind of just trained myself to be more productive and have that be the new norm, which is nice because, again, I've got a lot to do, and, it makes me happy to be able to accomplish things that are meaningful to me. And perhaps most importantly, I did really notice a diminishment of the cravings that I was having for a lot of these unhealthy things. Like, especially even like week 2, I noticed I wasn't craving sugar so much anymore. I do have a bit of a sweet tooth from time to time, so that was great. It makes it so much easier to abstain from something when you don't even crave it in the first place, right? So that was amazing. I do feel healthier. I still do feel healthier, and that does really make it easier to be happy, right? I mean, when you feel good in the moment like that, is just so close to the feeling of happiness. So that's fantastic. And also what I mentioned before, really important, just doing something to show yourself that you really value yourself and that you love yourself. Doing something really healthy for yourself, even if it's kind of uncomfortable and difficult at times, that maybe is going to be the thing that leaves the biggest impression on me at the end of this, and contributes to some kind of really sustained feeling of happiness. I did get the increase in happiness from achieving the goal, which is great, but I know that's not going to last that long, so I already have other things that I'm working towards that are meaningful to me. But at the end of the day, I really think it was showing myself some real love, even if it was difficult at moments, that made all the difference. There is a caveat about this whole practice that I do want to share with you, though, especially if you're using it just to increase your happiness. So, I mean, I feel like this is really effective as a productivity and motivation hack. So if that's something that you're struggling with, maybe really give this a shot and see what it does for you. But if your goal is to really just increase your happiness, I feel like this is useful, but there is something at the core of it that I just didn't really like in terms of a strategy for increasing your happiness. So let me explain, really at the basis of this whole fasting thing is an idea of negation or restriction, right? So you're kind of just walking around all day and you're thinking about, all the things that you can't have. And by avoiding all these things that you shouldn't have, somehow the end result of that is that you're happier. Which it can be the case, but I mean, if your goal is to stay in an elevated state of happiness as much as possible, that might not be the quickest or the wisest way to get there. And again, just thinking of what happiness feels like, you feel very present and radiant and free and connected with everything. And if you want to sustain that feeling, walking around all day and kind of shrinking yourself and going like, I can't have that experience, I can't have that, I need to watch out for this thing. To me, it took me out of that state of happiness a lot of the times when I had to really think about, oh, I can't engage in this, and oh, I can't engage in this. And the longer you do the dopamine fast, it becomes easier. You're not thinking about it as much, but just operating from that kind of a level of restriction, I feel like it might not be the most effective way to increase your happiness, on a moment-to-moment basis. So I think that's probably the reason that in this channel, in my life, maybe this is going to be the last really restrictive path or strategy that I try to increase my happiness. But I do think with a little bit of reworking, you can do something very similar to a dopamine fast to increase your happiness, but you just kind of change the philosophy at the core of this whole thing. Rather than being in a place of negation or restriction, you want to be in a place where you're just moving towards the things that add value and meaning and happiness to your life and your day-to-day experience. So rather than thinking about, I can't have this, I can't have this, I gotta watch out for this, instead you're like, I want to move towards that, I want to get closer to that, I want to do that project because it's going to make me feel more expanded, more radiant, more free, more blissful, make me feel like there's more meaning in my life and I'm more connected to everyone and everything. And I think just by moving closer to the things that are really going to make you happy, you might end up doing something really similar to a dopamine fast, where you're not engaging in any of these hedonistic pursuits because you're too busy pursuing the things that actually add meaning and value to your life. And I think just by simply changing that kind of core philosophy, it's going to allow you to stay in the state of happiness where you feel really unrestricted and expansive and free and present. And that's really valuable to me. That's my goal with this whole project, is to really just increase my happiness. That's what I'm after in my life. So I feel like that's the path that I'm going to try to pursue. So my 2 cents, I hope by watching this video you got something out of this. I mean, this whole experiment was super interesting and useful for me to take on, but I hope you learned something, and maybe you just learned that, like, hey, I don't want a dopamine fast, or hey, maybe I want to try it. So yeah, if you have any thoughts or questions that you want to share, go ahead and do that in the comments below. I'd love to check those out. And otherwise, I hope you have a beautiful day. Thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Thank you.